Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network. We're also streaming out at 21stcenturywire.com and X, Rumble, YouTube, Facebook Live, and also BitChute, as well as the audio streams. Thank you again for rejoining us. This is episode 536 of this weekly omnibus news and analysis radio program, again brought to you here on ACR. We're going to run with the first hour, and we're going to be talking about U.S. politics, geopolitics, and then after the break in Overdrive, we'll be joined hopefully by one of our team members to break down the latest in the Middle East and also the foreign policy front as it develops around the world. Certainly, we are living in very interesting times. There is no shortage of action, as Steve Bannon says, flood the zone. This is exactly what's happening with this new Trump administration. And with so much going on as well, it's great to get a good perspective. And the perspective that we like is the transatlantic perspective. And one of the great journalists right now, I think, on this front regarding Europe, U.S. foreign policy, is Thomas Fazi. And he'll be joining us right now on the live link. We're going to bring him up on stage.
Hey, Patrick. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to be with you as well, Thomas. And there's been, as we said, no shortage of action right now. I mean, a lot of people are surprised. And I know you've been writing on so many different aspects of what's going on right now with European politics, geopolitics. What's your general sort of feeling with the first month of the Trump administration so far from the European perspective, but also if you want to weigh in really on the U.S. domestic perspective, but your overall impressions so far?
Well, it's probably been crazier than most of us expected, even though, you know, we had some expectations of how Trump was likely to, you know, take a sledgehammer at the international, not just the domestic status quo, but also the international status quo. And he has clearly done that. I would say, yeah, even exceeding most people's expectations or fears, depending on your point of view, you know, for the good and the bad. You know, we've seen some, you know, incredibly insane statements and, you know, concerning obviously Gaza and Palestine and, you know, annexionist claims over, you know, Panama, Greenland, and other countries. You know, putting aside Palestine and Israel, where we're simply witnessing continuity with the Biden administration in many respects. On, you know, I wouldn't focus too much on what, even though, you know, a lot of people have had hysterical reactions to those statements, and of course they are, you know, worrying in and of themselves. You know, the desire to take over Greenland and other countries. But of course, he hasn't acted upon them yet. So, you know, maybe we shouldn't attach too much importance to everything that Trump says, and we should focus on what he does. And of course, when it comes to, you know, concrete action in the foreign policy arena, it's his major action so far has, of course, been taking very concrete steps to try to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end. And that can only be considered an unquestionably positive thing. Of course, you know, we haven't brought that war to an end yet, but of course, just taking steps towards bringing it to an end is an incredibly positive development. I mean, we're talking about potentially bringing an end to the bloodiest war on European soil since World War II, which has caused, you know, untold destruction, untold bloodshed on both sides, massive economic consequences for Europe, for ordinary Europeans. So, you know, Europeans should only rejoice at the prospect of that war coming to an end. And instead, we're seeing the exact opposite. We're seeing what I have recently termed peace derangement syndrome, where European leaders seem to be, you know, losing their minds at the very idea that the war in Ukraine could come to an end. You know, so at the moment, you know, I'm not writing any blank checks. You know, after Trump, I mean, I'm very much on, you know, on the same page as you are on this topic. You know, in the sense that I will judge him on what he does, and I think he'll do good things, and he'll do probably very, very insanely bad things as well, as most U.S. presidents do. So we'll wait and see. So, but when it comes to Ukraine, I'm honestly shocked. I'm more concerned at the moment about Europe and European leadership than I am about Trump. As a European, I'm way more scared by our own leaders than by Trump. Incredibly more scared, because I think they've gone insane. I mean, I think this reaction can, of course, be explained in rational terms, and it's quite simple to understand. European leaders have staked so much on this war, again, which, I mean, if we at least were winning this war, maybe they'd be able to find a way to spin it. But because even Trump himself is now admitting that we have lost this war, NATO has lost this war. It's you can understand why European leaders, purely from a kind of a survival standpoint, can't admit that the policies that they've been doubling down on for the past 3 years have proven completely futile. They haven't brought any benefit whatsoever to Ukraine. They've caused massive destruction to Europe, economic destruction to Europe. They've rendered Europe more geopolitically marginalized and really disregarded, and they've made Europe into the world's laughingstock, because, of course, everyone can see that Europe just blindly followed the US into this proxy war, despite the fact that it had nothing whatsoever to gain from it. I mean, from the standpoint of what can be considered kind of Europe's objective economic and security core interests. Of course, I'm sure the individual leaders might have, benefited in some way, or will benefit in the future, maybe in some lucrative position in the military-industrial complex or something. But in terms of Europe's interests, I mean, it's even a child could have told back then, and can tell even more clearly now, that there was no. It made no sense for Europe to follow America into this war, especially considering that this war, I think, from the U.S. standpoint, or at least from the standpoint of the previous administration, wasn't just a war aimed at using Ukraine to weaken Russia. It was a war that was aimed at using this conflict also to weaken Europe and to drive a wedge between Europe, and especially Germany and Russia. So Europe followed America into a war that was partly, targeted at Europe itself. I mean, it's hard to imagine being more of a vassal than that. So in purely rational terms, I mean, you can see why European leaders, they're already not faring too well in terms of public support and just overall legitimacy and consensus. I would say this is probably the most hated political class that Europe has ever seen, at least since World War II. And so this would be political suicide for them to say, okay, yeah, actually it was a mistake. We destroyed the European economy. We caused millions of Europeans to fall into poverty, while at the same time causing hundreds of thousands of people to die on both fronts. Not even for nothing, but to actually damage ourselves. So they can't do that. So they have to double down. So in purely rational terms, it makes sense. Also, and I would add, sort of in terms of a rational explanation, that precisely because they are so delegitimized, keeping the fear high, keeping the fear of Russia high, trying to maintain, kind of stoking up fears about an imminent Russian invasion is, of course, also a way of trying to hold on to power. Just using fear to hold on to a grip on power, basically. This is something that politicians have done throughout history, of course, often dreaming up or creating an a fictional external enemy as a way to control the domestic population. Of course, America has done this for most of its history, and Europeans are doing the same. I think they see I think they're staking their hopes on the fact that thanks to Russia, they may be able to repress and control the population more than they would be otherwise, and maybe even cancel elections in the future, which may which may not go the way they want them to go. They've already done that in Romania and threatened to do that in Germany, which is heading to the polls. And so you can see why. I mean, there are some rational explanations for why they would follow this insane policy, but at the same time, I think there's also an irrational element, especially because this game of chicken with Russia is so insanely dangerous. On some level, it's hard to explain in purely rational terms. And so, and I think again, we have to try to get into the mind of a vassal, and again, just imagine that you've been a diligent, the most diligent employee in the entire office, just doing whatever your boss told you, regardless of whether that hurt your interests, and so you've been you've been employee of the month for the past 3 years, and now there's a change of management. A new boss comes in and starts berating you for doing exactly what the previous boss had told you to do. You can see how that would cause most people to have a mental breakdown, and I think that kind of also explains peace derangement syndrome. And then we have a lot of psychological parallels. You could one could think. I mean, Europe has been in this kind of master-slave relationship with America for so long. I mean, essentially since World War II. Even though we've never reached the lows that we're witnessing now, but of course Europe has always been in a subordinate relationship to America. And so I think now that Trump is threatening to completely kind of upend that relationship, including by threatening to disengage from Europe, which of course is something that I don't think he's going to do, unfortunately, because I'm happy to see America shut down. It's dozens and dozens of military bases, and it's occupation forces that it still has on European soil since World War II. I kind of fear that that's not going to happen. He simply wants us to pay more for those bases and for those U.S. forces to remain in Europe. But you can see why once you've been in a if you've been in a subordinate relationship for so long, and that once that relationship comes to an end, it's easy to see how you could continue suffering from sort of an equivalent of Stockholm syndrome in a way, where in a way you've internalized the logic of the master to such an extent that you can't you can't do without it, and the idea of that master not controlling you anymore can actually cause you a lot of suffering. And so I think, and also all this grandstanding and this posturing and we're gonna double down on Ukraine, and we're gonna support Ukraine even more than the US has supported it until now. Even this, I think, is in a way, it's almost as if Europeans are subconsciously, trying to regain America's approval under Trump by, trying to, out America. America in a way by showing that yes, we're not the pussies that you always accused us of being, and now we're really gonna show you that we can be as American as you have always wanted us to be, and we can make a lot of other examples. So I think I think there are various levels that we can sort of use to understand what's happening in Europe, but either way, it's incredibly concerning, and I think we shouldn't underestimate just the potential that Europe has at the moment for derailing these peace talks. Because of course people are right when they say Europe has no way of, financially and militarily, allowing this war to continue. Of course, I mean, if NATO as a whole, with America, hasn't been able to secure a Ukrainian victory on the battlefield, how the hell can a purely European NATO, which has which doesn't even come close in terms of the military production that the US has, and even if we just were to buy all the stuff from the US, I mean, Europe has big financial issues at the moment, and of course it's it's not going to happen, of course, and but at the same time, I think there still is a potential for Europe to be able to, if not derail, seriously complicate these talks. I think there are factions within Ukraine that will continue fighting no matter what. So you can imagine, you can see how you could reach a formal agreement between, which the Ukrainian government subscribes to. But then you can imagine that the conflict continues in a form of sort of guerrilla warfare, with European governments playing a role there. And even if the conflict really comes to a full stop, which I think might be quite hard, but even if that succeeds, Europe is still fucked in terms of its relationship with Russia, because with the current European leadership, we're still looking at a scenario of permanently antagonistic and militarized relations with Russia, which of course poses security risks in the sense that, it means, you don't want to have a North Korea-like situation between not just Ukraine and Russia, but Europe and Russia, with the entire kind of Russian-European border being a potential sort of hotspot. But when you've got the current European foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas saying just a few weeks ago that Russia should be broken up into 6 mini states and that would be the best outcome, and you've got virtually every European leader saying virtually every day that we have to prepare for a Russian invasion that is described as being almost inevitable, and in fact certain. So sort of you can see the risks there. As much as willing as Russia may be to reach peace and to renormalize relations, in this context, it's simply impossible. So of course, there's Europe is undergoing a lot of political upheavals, and there are upcoming elections in a number of countries. So the scenario might change, but honestly, I mean, in a very short term, I don't think it's going to change that much. I mean, everyone's talking about these German elections, but we're still most likely going to have another center-right, center-left grand coalition, with the AfD in opposition, and of course that's going to apply some pressure on the government. But we're not going to have this massive change of leadership. It's not going to be a paradigm change in Germany. I think, especially considering that Merz is, the likely future chancellor of Germany is essentially a BlackRock man who's spent his life serving U.S. financial and corporate interests, and a diehard Atlanticist who has, taken hyper hawkish positions on Ukraine. To this day. So again, let's not overestimate, the likelihood of, imminent political change in Europe. So this is I think kind of where we're at. So very interesting and potentially positive times, but also very dangerous times.
Yeah, it seems like there's a kind of potential fork in the road for Europe. I mean, it's like Ukraine has allowed the rudderless kind of European looking for a purpose, the Union looking for a purpose, and Ukraine kind of provided that temporary hit, that dopamine hit for European leadership, as you said, very lukewarm leadership, and it provided that purpose. And even with Brexit, this Trump spat has brought Keir Starmer together with Macron in their emergency meeting, and it's almost like all our past differences are healed now. We're together for democracy and saving Ukraine, but at the same time, the U.S. is putting pressure on them. So the U.S. pulls out, says we're not going to tangle militarily with Russia, but the U.S. is saying you need to spend 5% of GDP on NATO budget. So it's like the protection racket without the protection, basically. So you pay up. But why would Russia be a threat to Europe if the US has got some kind of rapprochement going between Moscow and Washington? It seems like Europe is safe at that point. So who's really the driving force behind the tension at this point? Is there a fork in the road here, and which way is Europe going to go?
Yeah. No, I mean, let's be clear about that. I mean, Russia poses no realistic military threat to Europe. If by that we mean, Russian tanks rolling through Berlin, which is something that German politicians talk about with a straight face. Like, if we don't ramp up military spending, we're going to have the Russians, rolling into Berlin once more. And that, says a lot, I guess, about the kind of, subconscious associations that they make in their mind with previous moments of German history. But it's completely insane. I mean, honestly, Russia not only doesn't have the means to sort of mount a massive land invasion of Western Europe. I mean, it's hard to even talk about it without laughing, but clearly it doesn't have the intent to do it. Why would Russia want to, take over Europe, just because, and the only explanation that we usually get is because Putin is utterly crazy, and he'll do it, just for the kick of it. I mean, I mean, these are not serious discussions at all. And then, of course, one could argue, okay, but Russia may not want to, may not have the means to invade Europe, but of course it can strike Europe with a missile. It can strike any European capital with a missile. Yes, of course it could do that. It does have the technical means to do that. I would still argue it doesn't have any reason to do that now. But of course, it does have the means to do that, which of course is the key reason why you want to have the Tente with Russia, why you want to normalize relations with this huge nuclear armed country which possesses the means to destroy Europe. You want to make peace, you want to normalize relations with this country as soon as possible. Now, Russia has no intention of just launching a random missile attack on Europe, because of course that would probably be the beginning of a world-destroying nuclear war. And I don't think Russia has a death wish in that sense. I mean, I think European leaders seem to have a much bigger death wish than Putin does. And again, I think there's, we could talk a lot about the psychological aspects of the death wish drive that we have seen in Europe over the past 3 years. I think there's a lot, has a lot to do with kind of nihilistic culture that has taken over the West. But that's another story. But again, so it's, it's the irrationality of this. So on the one hand, you're saying Putin is absolutely crazy, while at the same time constantly poking him and attacking him, and saying that we have to prepare for the for a war or for an attack that is considered to be inevitable. Now you can see what that makes sense. Like, even if you believe that, you wouldn't say it openly, because all you're telling your supposed existential enemy is to preemptively attack you before you have the means to attack him. So I mean, honestly, I mean, I don't see that happening in the short term, but clearly, I mean, the current European leadership could pose potentially, I mean, down the road, a serious risk to Russia, because they are so unhinged. So I think it is a very dangerous situation, and you're right to ask, like, who is driving this? I think that's an interesting question, because of course, if you assume that America is the executive, and it's always been sort of the White House giving orders to Europe, then now that there's been a change of regime in the White House, then you should expect now there's new orders coming in, and everyone should just fall in line. So I think we partly tried to explain why that is not happening in the immediate short term, but I think we also have to think of America not as this monolithic bloc, and certainly not as a bloc where the White House is the only driving force of U.S. foreign policy, right? I think, European countries, European leaders, European states, and the apparatuses, the intelligence and military apparatuses within those states, don't just have long-standing linkages with the formal institutions of power in America. They also have long-standing linkages with the more secretive institutions of American power, the American deep state. So you've got, of course, political linkages, at the executive level, and those have always existed clearly. But you've also got, in a way, really deep and strong linkages, between the U.S. deep state and the European deep states. So it's not inconceivable to think that they're also receiving orders from other channels, and if not orders, pressures from other channels, even within America, who may have an interest in derailing peace talks with Russia. I'm pretty sure that the U.S. military-industrial complex, which we know to be incredibly influential, isn't that happy about the prospect of billions of dollars of arms sales coming to a stop. It's a disaster for them. And of course, let's not forget that Europe has its own military-industrial complex. Of course, it's not as big or powerful as America's, but it's the one that has grown in relative terms much more thanks to the Ukraine war than the American military-industrial complex. So if you look at the stock market value of companies like Rheinmetall in Germany, Leonardo in Italy, and other arms manufacturers across Europe, the value of their stocks has jumped much more than the value of American arms manufacturers, because we never had such a colossal war just in Europe. So for them, it's been huge. And so just as the U.S. military-industrial complex, of course, exercises a strong influence, these companies also exercise strong influence on European politics. So I think, it's a slightly more complex picture, also in terms of understanding transatlantic relations, than just, it's not just about who is sitting in the White House. I think there are a number of sites of power, sites of influence, sites of pressure, and they're not all, even in America, and they're not all aligned with Trump. So I think that's also another issue to take into consideration. But yes, we are at a fork road, and honestly, it's hard to be optimistic in the short term. It really is. It really is. I mean, without regime change across Europe, it's really hard to imagine that this could end well. I mean, the most likely prospect, so barring the more extreme scenarios of nuclear annihilation and outright war with Russia, which at the moment, luckily, is still quite a far scenario, but it's one that could come into being, I think, further down the road if we continue down this path. But just one where Europe remains completely economically and politically cut off from Russia, from its natural neighbor with whom it has a sort of a natural interest in strengthening relations with. And this is tragic. I mean, I think it's truly tragic. I mean, I know that there are different sentiments across Europe when it comes to Russia, and this is one of Europe's problems. We speak of Europe as a monolith, and again, I mean, from a psychological standpoint, I do understand why, I don't know, the Baltics or certain Eastern countries fear Russia. Again, I think it's irrational. It doesn't make for good foreign policy. But I can understand it on a psychological level. I mean, just as I can understand, an individual who's been a victim of trauma, and and that can pass down through generations. And this is kind of psychology 101. I mean, it's not. But at the same time, I think that politics to try to rise above that, because irrational fears, driven by historical traumas, don't make for good foreign policy. But I do understand it. But Western Europe has a very, very different relationship with Russia. We have none of those sort of historical traumas, historical fears. In fact, for many people in my country, Italy, Russia has always been a country with whom we've always had a deep, intimate connection on a cultural level, through literature, through music, through other forms of arts, politically, of course, because Western Europe, for a long time, had very powerful socialist and communist countries, which obviously had ties to Russia, which also translated then into economic ties between Italy and Russia and other Western European countries and Russia. So for me, what is I think this is probably ultimately, of course, the bloodshed and the destruction is absolutely tragic, but I think what's for Europe's future, I think what's most tragic is the fact that really, if America, or at least the previous administration, even though I think this is a strategy that goes further back than the Biden administration, because America has always had this kind of geostrategic imperative of maintaining Russia and Europe separated, and this outcome has been achieved. Like, whatever happens, I think the American state, which sort of transcends individual administrations, has succeeded in achieving that goal. That goal has been achieved, and this will remain a fact of sort of European geopolitics, I think, for a very long time. We're gonna need a complete regime change across at least major, at least Western European countries, which start and which can start mending relations with Russia, but it's going to take a long time, and Russia is understandably going to be very distrustful of any sort of overtures coming from Europe. It's given what the betrayal of the Minsk agreements and all that story. So that's why it's kind of hard to be optimistic, and it makes me say that the US might have failed a lot of its goals in this war, especially its goal of weakening Russia, if not defeating it. I'm not sure if they ever really truly believed they could defeat Russia. I think they were just happy with bleeding Russia as much as possible. But they've clearly achieved what was one of their overarching goals, which was to separate Europe and Russia for good, or at least for a very long time, and they've succeeded that. And in a way, now Trump can reap the benefits of that, while at the same time making peace with Russia. I mean, you got to give it to the Americans. I mean, clearly they're smarter than the Europeans, obviously. So now, he can swoop in and actually, mend relations. Now he's openly talking of lifting sanctions on Russia and reestablishing, economic relations with Russia. So now he's going to benefit from this newfound friendship, while leaving Europe and Russia in the state of enmity, which they themselves, contributed to a large degree. But of course, we allowed ourselves to be taken for a ride. So in a way, we deserve everything we've got coming.
It's incredible. I mean, what a move! They always make jokes about Trump's 5D chess, and I don't know if it's the intended effect, but Trump has this effect just by his bolshiness and this unpredictability and his willingness to kind of impose his administration's will on the situation. That, quite frankly, nobody's used to this for so many years compared to the Biden administration. And previous Trump administration was, I think, handcuffed most of the time, very ineffectual, having to overcompensate and be more anti-Russian just to prove to the Democrats and the impeachment mobs that he wasn't a secret agent of the Kremlin. Yeah. But this is totally different. This is a different situation. But Munich Security Conference the Davos of defense. This roadshow came into Europe recently, and you penned an article that caused quite a few waves. Maybe one of the biggest, most read articles I think that you have written, Thomas. J.D. Vance's Munich speech was full of contradictions, and while this was an interesting article, and you brought up some very important points, which I hope you'll summarize here, but what was even more surprising was the reaction in the comment threads on X that the vice president himself inserted himself into the conversation. So tell us about this article, and then, how surprised were you that you were interacting with the number 2 in power in the United States? Go ahead, Thomas.
Yes, it was, again, clear sign of the incredibly weird times that we're living, that the American vice president would take the time to respond to an article a critical article by a journalist. And I think, again, maybe this points to the sort of radical sort of authority of this administration compared to the previous one, because it's, it would have been unimaginable for anyone in the previous administration, any top official, at least the previous administration, engaging with a journalist on X. So let's take this as a positive sign. In my article, I simply, I was sort of responding. I wasn't responding to Vance himself, because I didn't think he would have read the article, even though I guess he did end up reading it. But I was more trying to engage with this kind of knee-jerk reaction that I saw in a lot of the dissident or communities in Europe, just clapping at Vance's speech, saying, what a fantastic speech. Yeah, he's sticking it, to those European tyrants. He's telling it like it is, accusing them of being a bunch of, censorious freaks who arresting people for posts on social media, and even arresting people for silent praying in the UK, which Vance spoke about in his talk. And he even calls out the Europeans for essentially cancelling the elections in Romania and threatening to cancel all the elections in Germany. And he was clearly referring to Thierry Breton's statement there about this. And so now I can understand why a lot of us who have been criticizing these policies for a long time, why we would feel a sense of schadenfreude at seeing European leaders getting berated by their master, and getting told, and hearing them say from the American vice president what we have been writing and talking about for so long. Yes, of course, I also got a kick out of this, but I think we also, need to be a bit more cool-headed. And what I said in the article was that as much as I subscribe to a lot of what Vance was saying about Europe, I think there were some parts that were missing from his talk, and primarily America's key role in often driving these policies. Take Romania. Clearly, I mean, I don't think Europe or the EU took the lead on Romania. I mean, I think that the U.S. State Department took the lead in pressuring the Romanian government to cancel the elections. I don't think it was I think Europeans were simply really following America's lead on a lot of these policies. Of course, we know, the crucial role that NATO, which has always been kind of, a Washington-led organization, played in driving the kind of, censorship industrial complex. And, Mike Pence has, spoken a lot about this. And so the idea that all these policies, are kind of homegrown, or solely Europe's responsibilities, I found a bit rich. I think it's, and I felt like Vance was kind of whitewashing America's role in bringing about a lot of these policies. And yeah, surprisingly, after a couple of days, that the article was published, Vance himself replied to the article on X, and saying that he thought the accusations were unfair. Because he says, but in my speech I mentioned the Biden administration was also engaged in censorship. That was kind of the gist of his argument. Yes, that's true. But still, what we're talking about here is something a bit bigger than that. Yes, of course, you're criticizing your previous administration. They're your arch enemies. What I'm talking about here is specifically, America's role in bringing about not just these specific policies. And that's what I told him in my response to his response. I was like, look, I mean, regardless, this is something that goes even way further back than the Biden administration. I mean, I think if Europe has such a feckless leadership today, it's also because the US has spent the last decades, essentially since World War II, trying to exercise its influence, its economic, political, and military influence over Europe. And over time, this has bred a deeply infantilized political class, which exactly has sort of accustomed itself to being really a completely to be completely subordinate to the US. And this is why, I mean, they allowed themselves to just blindly follow the Biden administration into and even the previous administrations into the disaster of the Ukraine proxy war. But we have to understand that this has deeper roots. Under previous generations of political leadership in Europe, I mean, I would argue that this would never have happened. And in fact, for example, I mean, I think that it's questionable even if Angela Merkel, sort of the last old school European statist, would have allowed Germany to be pulled in so deep into this. But that's another story, But and so my point, my final point of advance was, look, I mean, this is ultimately, if Europeans have to take, we're never going to get out of the situation unless Europeans take their own fate into their own hands, and this means breaking free from US control and domination, which has been ongoing for decades, and which is one of the key reasons why we have such a poor political class. And again, I mean, I think it's important to stress, and we could speak out about how the US has gone about bringing this situation of control. And it's not just something that naturally evolved out of America's soft power, and that we just all fell for American hegemony. I mean, we're talking of numerous, for example, political leaders who were critical of their country's subordination to the US and to NATO, that were murdered, that died in very mysterious circumstances. Italy has a long history of anyone that was critical of US domination literally being killed off,
Sweden
by the CIA. So this is the kind of influence that we're talking about, right? I mean, this is not
Swedish former Swedish PM Olof Palme, and the list goes on. So
every country has at least one, major political leader that died in, at least, who was critical of America and died in mysterious circumstances. So this is what we're talking about. And so, so I think the point is, if you're serious about what you're saying, let's acknowledge the whole history of how we got to this point and America's responsibilities in this. And as I think, Arnaud Bertrand, he sort of added to this. I think he said, very poignant. He made a very poignant argument. He was like, look, I mean, it's like, even just because you've had elections in a country, just because if a country bombs another country or invades another country, just because then you have an election in the country that invaded, that new government doesn't get to accuse the bombed country of being responsible for the sorry state that it's in. I'm not saying it's a completely perfect analogy, of course, it's slightly more complex here, but this is kind of what we saw. I mean, because there's a new administration, then as a country, as a state, we have no historical responsibility because we didn't do it. As in, Trump and JD Vance. Yes, I know you guys didn't do it, but at the same time, you belong to your leaders of a country that has a long history, and I think you have to acknowledge that history, and you can't just say that's nothing to do with that, to do with us, because we weren't there or it didn't happen under our watch. And so the question, moving forward for Europe is, is America really interested in, giving Europe autonomy, or is all this talk of, as you were saying, disengagement from Europe and disengagement from NATO just a way of changing the form of US control without changing the substance? And again, talking of meddling in European politics, I'm sorry, and this is not about taking sides, whether one prefers, the populist sort of mainstream. I think it's clear how much, I hate the current European political mainstream. But at the same time, I mean, current US administration is openly supporting sort of a new generation of populist parties in Europe, right? And regardless of what we think of those parties, this is, again, a clear form of foreign interference. So again, you can see the contradictions. And this is another contradiction, I think, in Vance's arguments. He was like, yes, I mean, the previous administration, meddled a lot in European politics, but we're not going to do that. But at the same time, I'm basically doing a speech where I'm telling the entire European political, current leadership to step aside and let, our new friends come to power in Europe, and that'll solve all the problems. Yeah, it might solve the problems in terms, for America, but it won't solve European problems, regardless of whether these new parties might pursue to some degree better policies, but it won't change the underlying dynamics of European-American relations. If we simply have a change of regime in Europe, but and so we have a new generation of political leaders that come to power with different with different policy ideas, but who still subscribe to the idea that who are still psychologically subordinated to Washington. And I think there's a very real risk of this happening. As we saw, in the AfD leaders fawning, over Musk and Trump, and numerous similar examples of that.
Well, I knew you were alluding to Elon Musk there, and this is his virtual appearance at the AfD rally.
Yeah.
And, he really rails on George Soros a lot. He's been tweeting about Soros, and Soros is doing this, Soros is doing that. But isn't Elon Musk playing the role of Soros, but for the right wing of the political conversation? But in the end, it's all for Uncle Sam, as it was for George and it is for Elon. And this idea that the richest man in the world can donate or bundle $250 million to the Trump campaign, which is equivalent to what the Israeli lobby have put together for the Trump campaign, and buy himself a seat in the White House and make the White House a co-work space for himself. It's kind of a new thing, and Thomas, yeah. I'm an old-fashioned American, and I'm not so comfortable with that prospect. It is stepping into a new domain in terms of the corporativism, to steal. I didn't mean to steal that term from the former Italian leader back in the Second World War, but it's akin to fascism in that sort of orthodox definition sense. Yeah. And I think this is worth addressing, and there's legitimate criticisms, because if you're going to govern, you have to govern for everybody and not just one particular interest class. I mean, it's a good question to end on here, Thomas, but what are your feelings about tech bros and this kind of trend and the accumulation of wealth and influence and power?
Well, I mean, I think it's, I think I see this administration as being kind of a mask-off moment for American power. We see this in the foreign policy arena, where Trump, openly says what previous administrations would do without admitting that they were doing it, and in fact, while saying that they were doing the exact opposite. So whether it's ends up being better or worse for the rest of the world, I think will remain to be seen. But I think honesty is something that we can work with, and Trump openly stating what his aims are in terms of raw, naked kind of geopolitical interests. I think that's hopefully something that will make it clearer to most people, how America operates. Again, I don't see a fundamental, change in terms of actual policies and actual kind of geopolitical imperatives. I mean, the tactical changes, but I think the kind of hegemonic drive remains the same. But in terms of sort of the domestic organization of power, again, it's a mask-off moment. I mean, of course, America has always been an oligarchy and has increasingly so over the past few decades. Biden administration was just as much beholden to American oligarchs as the current Trump administration is. But again, the difference was that under previous administrations, especially under the Biden administration, they operated sort of behind the scenes. They operated in the shadows, even though they were, of course, just as influential as Musk is, for example, over the current Trump administration. So again, Musk, the richest man in the world, the number one sort of tech oligarch in the world, setting up shop inside the White House, and even openly like kind of telling Trump what to do, and almost like speaking down to him on some occasions. It's a mask-off moment. I mean, this is now this is not a sort of a radical paradigm change in the sense that this has always been going on behind the scenes, but now we're seeing now we can all see it happening, live, right? And again, this is, I think, useful. So when you see liberals, and even Biden in his farewell speech complaining about, the oligarchic takeover of America, now that's a fanciful take. I mean, that's that's quite laughable, because America had already been taken over by oligarchs. I would say, especially under Biden, but of course, they just the Biden administration was about putting up, a simulacrum of how power operates. In a way, Trump has done away with the simulacrum, and he's just like openly, he's sort of taking down the veil and showing the world, just openly showing the world how American power operates and the influence that oligarchs have over American power. So I think it's of course it's concerning. I mean, but again, I see this as sort of an extreme degeneration of a trend that has been ongoing for a long time, and ultimately it's a reminder that America is not a democracy. I mean, it's not, you're not a democracy. Democracy is not just about being allowed to vote. It should be, democracy should be about being given a chance to truly access, the corridors of power for ordinary people, for working classes, for the masses to truly access the corridors of power. And instead, what we have in America, as in most Western democracies, is the only choice we're offered, if that, is between two different factions of the elites, two different factions of the oligarchy. So so ultimately, what the previous election was in America was essentially a battle. It was an election between two different factions of the oligarchy. Biden responded to kind of certain factions, older factions of the American oligarchy, of the American elite. Trump represents the sort of newer, the oligarchic startups in a way. So there's a new generation of oligarchs who want a greater piece of the pie, and this is what a lot of what is happening behind the scenes is about. It's about these new oligarchs wanting a greater share of the pie at the expense of other older factions of the oligarchy. But we shouldn't be mistaken about the fact that ultimately this is what it is. It's a clash of different factions of the elite.
Yes, and we can only hope that this faction is more benevolent and thoughtful and considerate than the previous faction. And there are some very positive indications initially, but I reserve my judgment, as I'm sure you do, for the midterms, and we'll see how things develop. But we'll take the W's, but we'll also be very vigilant in kind of surveying the situation. But Thomas Fazi, regular columnist at Unheard, it's a great publication. There's a lot of great writers there, Thomas being one of the best, I would say, and also Substack, Thomas Fazi. You want to visit here and follow him as well at Battle for Europe on X. You'll see, we'll bring his lower third back there, Battle for Europe. Just go visit and follow Thomas. Some great takes, folks, and great conversations that Thomas is right in the middle of. So we really appreciate you joining us on the Sunday Wire this week, Thomas.
Thank you, Patrick. It was a pleasure.
And there he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Thomas Fazi. And we're going to be transitioning now to a break. And when we come back in Overdrive, we will continue the conversation about the most important stories, both domestically in the U.S., in Europe, and internationally as well. I'm Patrick Henningsen. Stay with us. We'll be right back.